Ma'am, I'm going to need to see what's in the bag. The voice was young, clipped with the brittle authority of someone who had only recently been granted it. Corporal Davies stood with his feet planted shoulder-width apart, his posture a perfect imitation of the training posters that lined the walls of the recruitment office. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the old woman before him with a practiced suspicion that mistook age for irrelevance and poverty for threat. She was a slight figure, weathered by sun and time, her face a roadmap of a life lived far from the polished marble floors of this national military archive. She clutched a faded canvas duffel bag, its straps frayed, its fabric softened by countless journeys. The woman, Alara Vance, offered no resistance. She simply met his gaze with eyes the color of a winter sky, calm and deep, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. She placed the bag on the security table. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant, reverent hum of the building's climate control system, a sound that seemed to mock the tension brewing at its entrance. Lance Corporal Shaw, younger and even more eager than Davies, stepped forward with a latex-gloved hand. "Let's see what we've got here," he said, his tone a performance of bored professionalism for the small line of visitors forming behind them. He unzipped the bag with a harsh, grating sound. Alara's hands, resting at her sides, curled slightly, the knuckles white against her worn skin. It was the only sign of the storm gathering behind her placid expression. She said nothing. Her stillness was an unnerving counterpoint to the boy's restless energy, a silent rebuke they were too young and too proud to comprehend. They saw a transient, a problem to be managed, a disruption to the day's orderly proceedings. They could not see the ghost of a warrior standing before them, a sentinel whose watch had never truly ended. Shaw began to empty the bag's contents onto the cold steel table, his movements careless, almost contemptuous. First came a wool blanket, neatly folded but threadbare, its edges worn to a soft fuzz. He tossed it aside. Next, a battered canteen, its metal surface dented and scratched, followed by a small, leather-bound book whose pages were yellowed and soft with age. He flipped through it dismissively, seeing only faded handwriting, not the final letters of fallen comrades. "Not much in here, is there?" Shaw commented to Davies, a smirk playing on his lips. Traveling light, Davies grunted in agreement, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze fixed on Alara, as if daring her to object. "Ma'am, what is your business at the archive today?" he asked, his voice layered with an unearned condescension. "This is a place of honor. For those who served. You understand." Alara's eyes did not waver. They held his for a long moment, and in their depths, Davies felt an unsettling flicker of something ancient and formidable. It was a look that had fixed targets in the jungle gloom, a look that had comforted the dying and faced down the enemy. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to take a step back, but his pride held him fast. He mistook his unease for irritation and hardened his expression. From the back of the line, a young woman named Samira Joshi watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of disquiet. A doctoral candidate researching forgotten military histories, she was more attuned than most to the subtle signifiers of service. Her eyes were drawn to Alara's wrist, where a sliver of dark ink was visible just beyond the frayed cuff of her sleeve. It was a faded tattoo, its lines blurred by time, but its shape was distinct to a trained eye, the silhouette of a nightingale in flight, its wings encircling a single, stylized tear. It was an insignia she had seen only once before, in a heavily redacted file deep within the digital archives, a unit so secret its existence was officially denied. The final item in the bag was wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a simple piece of twine. Shaw picked it up, weighing it in his hand. It was rectangular, solid. He unwrapped it with impatient fingers, revealing a field-stripped meal, ready to eat, its brown packaging dated decades earlier. Tucked into the twine was a small, tarnished silver pin, no larger than a thumbnail, depicting a single, upward-pointing dagger. Shaw let out a short, derisive laugh. "Bringing your own lunch? What's this piece of junk?" He held up the pin between his thumb and forefinger, the metal glinting dully under the fluorescent lights. He began to work the pin free from the twine, intending to toss it into the small bin for prohibited items. The air grew still. The low hum of the building seemed to fade into nothingness. For the first time, Elara spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the sterile air with the chilling authority of a blade being drawn from its sheath. Do not touch that. It was not a plea. It was not a request. It was a command, forged in fire and loss, delivered with a quiet finality that resonated in the very bones of the two young Marines. They froze, startled by the sheer, unshakable power in those three simple words. The force of her will was a physical presence in the space between them. Shaw's hand hovered over the pin, his arrogance momentarily checked by a primal instinct he didn't understand. Davies, however, felt his authority being challenged. His face flushed with anger. Who was this homeless woman to give them orders? He took a half-step forward, puffing out his chest. "You're in no position to be giving orders, ma'am," he snapped, his voice louder than necessary. "This is a restricted item," he gestured to Shaw. "Get rid of it." He had crossed a line. He just didn't know that the line was a border to a sacred past, a past he was about to profane. Samira Joshi's heart hammered against her ribs. The pin. The dagger. It was the informal unit crest of Task Force Nightingale, the ghosts of the Anamites. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through her contacts. She found the number she was looking for, the private line of the archives director, a retired general she had interviewed for her dissertation. Her voice was a hushed, urgent whisper as she explained what she was seeing. "Sir, you need to get to the main entrance. Now, there's a woman here. I think she's one of them. They're disrespecting her." As Shaw's fingers closed around the small silver pin, a black command vehicle with 4-star flags mounted on its fenders pulled up to the curb with a barely audible squeal of tires. The rear door flew open and General Marcus Thorne emerged, his 6'4" frame radiating an aura of pure, undiluted command. His dress uniform was immaculate, his chest a constellation of ribbons, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't walk. He moved like a storm front, his two aides struggling to keep pace. The polished doors of the archive hissed open before him, and he strode into the lobby, his eyes already locked on the tableau at the security checkpoint. Corporal Davies and Lance Corporal Shaw saw him at the same moment. Their bravado evaporated like mist in a desert sun. Their spines snapped straight. Their hands flew up in salutes so sharp they seemed to vibrate. "General, sir," Davies stammered, his face draining of all color. Thorne ignored them completely. His gaze swept past their terrified faces and settled on Elara Vance. The fury on his face dissolved, replaced by something akin to awe, to reverence. He came to a halt 3 feet before her, drew himself to his full height, and executed the single most profound salute of his 40-year career. It was a gesture of absolute, unconditional respect, a tribute from a 4-star general to a forgotten legend. "Colonel Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is an honor." The words hung in the air, electric and impossible. "Colonel." The title crashed into Davies and Shaw with the force of a physical blow. Their mouths hung open, their minds struggling to reconcile the word with the woman standing before them. They were paralyzed by a shame so profound it felt like drowning. General Thorne's attention snapped back to them, his eyes now chips of ice. "What, in God's name, did you think you were doing?" His voice was a low growl, a promise of imminent and terrible consequences. He saw the pin lying on the table where Shaw had dropped it. He reached down and picked it up with a reverence that bordered on worship, holding it in the palm of his hand, as if it were a holy relic. "Do you have any idea what this is?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Do you?" He didn't wait for an answer. "This is the informal unit citation for Task Force Nightingale, an experimental deep reconnaissance and rescue unit operating under MECVSOG during the darkest days in Southeast Asia. Their operational name was the Ghosts. When their mission profile was deemed too politically sensitive, they were disavowed. Their records were sealed, their names erased, their existence denied under the Phoenix Mandate of 1971. They were declared ghosts, and they were left to haunt the world alone, carrying burdens we can't even imagine. The general's voice echoed in the cavernous lobby, a history lesson delivered with the righteous fury of an avenging angel. Every visitor in line was frozen, listening, their phones forgotten. This was a moment of living history, raw and painful and utterly compelling. Thorne's gaze fell upon the old MRE. He knew, with the certainty of a career soldier, that it was not just a meal. General Thorne gently took the MRE from the table. This meal, he said, his voice softening slightly, was the last one she was supposed to share with her commanding officer, Major Thomas Pathfinder Callahan. They made a pact that after their final tour, they would sit on a porch somewhere in the Blue Ridge Mountains and share one last field ration for old time's sake. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Major Callahan never made it to that porch. He was killed saving 3 of his men during the evacuation of Firebase Azure. He died in then Captain Vance's arms. Her call sign was Wraith. She was called that because she could move through the jungle without a sound, and because every man she ever lost haunted her. He looked directly at the 2 young Marines, his eyes burning with an intensity that stripped them bare. For 50 years, Colonel Vance has carried this meal. It is not lunch. It is a memorial. It is a promise. It is a tombstone for a man whose grave is marked unknown, and you treated it like trash. You treated her like trash. The general's voice was now quiet, but it carried a razor's edge. He spoke of a specific mission, one whose details remained classified to all but a handful of living souls. He spoke of the Tet Offensive, of a long-range penetration mission gone horribly wrong. He described how Captain Vance, her team compromised and surrounded, single-handedly held a narrow jungle pass for 72 hours, armed with little more than her rifle, a K-bar knife, and an unbreakable will. She bought the time for her surviving team members to be extracted, repelling wave after wave of enemy assaults until reinforcements finally arrived. They found her unconscious, surrounded by the bodies of the fallen, her weapon empty, her knife broken. She had refused the medevac until every one of her men, living and dead, was accounted for. The full weight of their transgression crushed down on Corporal Davies and Lance Corporal Shaw. They were not just facing a general. They were standing in the shadow of a giant, a hero whose sacrifices had paved the way for the very uniform they wore with such unthinking pride. Their arrogance was revealed for what it was, the hollow bravado of children playing at being soldiers. They had mistaken quiet dignity for weakness, and in doing so, had committed a sacrilege against the very institution they had sworn to serve. General Thorne turned his back on them, a gesture of dismissal more damning than any reprimand. He began to repack Alara's bag himself. With the meticulous precision of a flag detail, he folded her worn blanket. He placed the book gently inside, followed by the canteen. Finally, he took the MRE and the small silver pin. He carefully retied the pin to the package with the old twine, his large, powerful hands surprisingly gentle. He placed the sacred meal back in the bag and zipped it closed. He held the duffel bag for a moment before turning back to Alara. "Colonel Vance," he said, his voice now formal but warm. "Your escort is here. We have your permanent quarters at the Patton residence prepared. The Secretary of Defense sends his deepest apologies for this oversight." He handed her the bag. Alara took it, her gaze moving from the general to the 2 young men who stood rigid and pale, their eyes locked on some distant point on the wall, their careers and their self-respect in ruins. She saw their youth, their foolish pride, the terrible weight of their mistake. She saw not monsters, but boys. In her eyes, there was no anger, no triumph. There was only a profound, weary sadness. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in their direction. "They are young," she said, her voice a quiet murmur. "They will learn." It was an act of grace, a quiet absolution that cut them more deeply than any punishment the general could devise. Forgiveness from the one they had wronged was a burden they would carry forever. The general understood. He nodded curtly, then offered Alara his arm. "This way, Colonel," as he personally escorted her past the security checkpoint and into the heart of the archive. A hastily assembled honor guard of museum staff and visiting officers snapped to attention, their salutes creating a corridor of respect. The sound of their heels clicking on the marble floor was a thunderous tribute. The story of what happened at the entrance spread through the building like wildfire, whispered from person to person in tones of shock and awe. Samira Joshi lowered her phone, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. She had come here to study history, and instead, she had witnessed it being honored, redeemed, and brought into the light. Back at the entrance, Corporal Davies and Lance Corporal Shaw remained at the position of attention, their bodies locked but their minds reeling. They were left to stand there under the watchful eyes of the master sergeant who had been summoned to oversee their immediate fate. They would face a formal inquiry, of course. Their careers as Marines were likely over before they had truly begun, but that was the lesser punishment. Their true sentence was the memory of Colonel Vance's eyes, the quiet power of her voice, and the crushing weight of her unearned forgiveness. They had been taught a lesson that no training manual could ever impart, that the greatest heroes are often hidden in plain sight, that true authority is not in a rank but in a soul, and that honor is not a thing to be demanded, but a thing to be humbly, reverently recognized in those who have paid its highest price. The image of the old woman and her sacred, uneaten meal would be seared into their minds, a permanent reminder of the day they met a ghost and desecrated her memorial, only to be saved by her grace.